Chapter 1. The Discovery. Daryal moved swiftly down the silent corridor, his footsteps echoing faintly in the metallic belly of the base. The night shift was usually quiet, the atmosphere heavy with the hum of dormant machines. But tonight a strange, delicate noise slipped through the air, like whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. He stopped, focusing his hearing toward a sealed chamber to his left. The base's protocol manuals assured him that this section was reserved for equipment storage. Yet, he could clearly hear what sounded like voices. He activated the keypad, overriding his clearance as he keyed in a higher security code, one he'd memorized from his early training sessions. The door slid open, revealing a cold, dimly lit room. Rows of containment cells lined the walls, each shielded by thick glass. Daryal's chest tightened as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Inside the cells, tiny figures huddled close, pressing against each other for warmth and comfort. They were human children, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. A girl no older than 6 looked up and spotted him, her gaze filled with a mix of terror and hope. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. "Are you here to help us?" Daryal's heart pounded. He stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Astra's children? Here? Astra's, their presence made no sense. The invasion, as he'd been taught, was strategic. The humans were threats, their adults considered dangerous and unpredictable. But children? This was not part of any protocol he'd ever been briefed on. Before he could gather his thoughts, a voice crackled through his communicator. "Daryal, report to Command Center immediately." It was Captain Jexer, his tone sharp and authoritative, leaving no room for hesitation. Daryal took one last glance at the children, then sealed the door and hurried back down the corridor. The command center was stark, sterile, and dominated by a massive holographic map of Earth, pulsing with strategic markers. Captain Jexer stood in front of it, hands clasped behind his back, his expression as cold as the steel walls around them. Daryal felt a mixture of dread and defiance as he approached. "You called for me, Captain?" Daryal said, keeping his voice steady. "Yes. I've been informed you accessed the containment wing without clearance." Jexer's voice was smooth, but edged with irritation. "Care to explain?" Daryal hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I heard something unusual. Voices. I investigated out of concern, only to find..." He swallowed, steadying himself. "Children. Human children." Jexer's lips twisted into a mocking smile. "And that surprises you?" "Captain, they're children," Daryal said, struggling to keep the emotion from his voice. "I understood our mission was to neutralize threats, but these are innocents. Why are they being held?" Jexer gave him a withering look, a trace of disdain in his eyes. "You're still young, Daryal, so let me educate you. Humans, even the young, are valuable leverage. Their fear can be useful in encouraging cooperation from their elders. Every asset has its purpose." Daryal felt a surge of revulsion. He joined the ranks out of a sense of duty and honor, believing that their mission was to bring order to a chaotic universe. But this, imprisoning children, terrorizing the helpless, this was nothing like the ideals he'd sworn to uphold. "And what purpose do you think this serves?" Daryal demanded, his voice barely a whisper. He realized he was treading dangerously close to insubordination, but he couldn't stop himself. "How does this align with our principles?" "With honor." Jexer laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Honor? That's a luxury we don't have. We are here to subdue, to control. Sentimentality has no place in our ranks." He stepped closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Perhaps you need to decide where your loyalties lie, Daryal. With your people, or with a handful of whimpering creatures?" A surge of anger rose in Daryal's chest, but he forced himself to stay silent. Arguing further would only put him at greater risk. Yet as he stood there, the weight of Jexer's words settling over him, he realized that his loyalty was no longer as certain as it had been. The faces of those terrified children lingered in his mind, haunting him. "Understood, Captain," he said finally, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. Jexer's gaze lingered, as if searching for weakness. "Good. You may return to your post. And Daryal, I trust this will be the last time we have this conversation. Daryal nodded, managing a curt salute before he turned and left the room. The hallway seemed darker than before, the hum of machinery colder and more menacing. He felt as though a part of him had shattered, his faith in his mission and his people splintered by what he'd just witnessed. As he made his way back to the containment wing, his thoughts whirled. He could still see the girl's eyes, a silent plea, fragile and hopeful. Against all his training and every protocol he'd been taught, he felt a powerful urge to do something, to defy Jexer's command and help the children escape. He reached the containment door and paused, his hand hovering over the keypad. He knew the risks, the potential consequences, but the memory of that small voice, whispering "please," was louder than any order, any code, or any threat. For a moment, he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, his resolve was set. He would not leave them to suffer in silence, not when he had the power to change their fate. With a quiet determination, Daryal input the override code once again, preparing to enter the chamber. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer turn a blind eye. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Moral Divide. Daryal's footsteps echoed as he retraced his path to the containment chamber, each step pulling him deeper into a web of doubt and defiance. His mind replayed the faces of the children he'd seen. Small, innocent beings, nothing like the threatening images the military had used to justify the invasion. He hadn't seen helplessness as a tool for strategy until tonight. The justification made him sick. He entered the chamber, closing the door quietly behind him. The children inside huddled together, their wide eyes watching him with a mix of hope and suspicion. He approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. A boy, barely in his teens, shifted protectively in front of the smaller ones. "I'm here to help you," Daryal said softly. He crouched down, his alien form as non-threatening as he could make it. "I know this isn't where you belong." One of the children, a girl clutching a frayed doll, looked at him, her lip trembling. "Will you let us go?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. Daryal nodded, though uncertainty tugged at him. "Yes, I'll find a way. But you must be silent and trust me." The boy met his gaze with a wary nod, clearly struggling to believe an alien could be an ally. The trust, fragile as it was, reminded Daryal of his own vulnerability. But seeing the children's relief steeled his resolve. He knew he couldn't act on his own. He'd need access to clearance codes and bypasses that would only be available through a higher-ranking officer. And he had only one option. Bracing himself, he left the chamber, his mind racing. The main command deck was a hub of activity, though it had quieted as the night shift took over. Captain Jexer was where Daryal had expected to find him, standing at the observation console, studying the planet below. Daryal approached, straightening his posture. "Captain," he said, his voice level. Jexer turned, arching a brow. "Back so soon? I thought our previous conversation clarified things for you." "It did, sir." Daryal paused, steadying his breath. "But I wanted to speak further. About resources." "Resources?" Jexer repeated, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Humans can be useful in other ways. There's strategic value in showing mercy," Daryal said, carefully choosing each word. "Keeping them caged may inspire only defiance. Releasing them, selectively, might encourage cooperation." Jexer laughed, short and dismissive. "Mercy?" He looked Daryal over, as if seeing him for the first time. "You're a soldier, Daryal, not a diplomat. Humans respect force, not mercy. And those children are tools. Only a sentimental fool would think otherwise." Daryal bristled but kept his face neutral. "Perhaps, sir, but we could use leverage without lowering ourselves to such measures." He forced himself to sound pragmatic, hoping to veil his true intentions. Jexer's gaze hardened. "Be careful, soldier. Sentimentality can be dangerous." "Yes, sir." Daryal held Jexer's gaze, feeling a steely resolve solidify within him. He couldn't sway Jexer, but he didn't need to. His position had given him access to the codes he required. As Jexer dismissed him with a cold nod, Daryal felt the weight of his decision settle in. He had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. Back in the containment wing, Daryal entered the codes into the chamber's control panel, releasing the children from their cells. The doors slid open, and the children hesitantly stepped out, casting glances of wonder and trepidation at their unexpected rescuer. "Follow closely and stay quiet," Daryal instructed, his voice low. "We don't have much time." The smallest among them, a little girl clutching her doll, reached out, gripping his hand. Her tiny fingers were cold, trembling with fear. Daryal gave her a reassuring nod as they slipped through the corridors, keeping to the shadows. As they reached the docking bay, an alarm blared, shattering the silence. Daryal's heart sank. He'd been so focused on freeing the children that he hadn't considered the base's automated detection systems. They had only minutes before the patrols arrived. "Run," he whispered, leading them through a maze of corridors. The children stumbled, their breaths quick and panicked. But Daryal's calm encouragement kept them moving. He pushed aside every thought of the consequences. He'd made a choice. There was no room for hesitation now. Rounding a corner, they found themselves face to face with Jexer, flanked by 2 guards. The captain's expression was a mix of fury and disbelief. "So, the Honorable Daryal has chosen his side," Jexer sneered. "Against his own kind, no less." Daryal positioned himself between Jexer and the children, his voice firm. "This is an honor, Captain. It's cruelty. We cannot call ourselves just while holding innocents captive." Jexer's eyes narrowed, and he signaled to the guards. "Take them back to their cells. As for you, Daryal, I'll ensure you're an example to anyone else with such misguided ideas." The guards advanced, but Daryal moved quickly, disarming one with a swift strike and knocking him to the ground. The other guard hesitated, perhaps startled by Daryal's resolve. Seeing his chance, Daryal grabbed the second guard's weapon and aimed it at Jexer. "Enough," Daryal said, his voice steady but cold. "Let them go." Jexer glared, a look of venomous contempt twisting his features. "This is treason, Daryal. You'll die a traitor." Daryal held his gaze unflinching. "Then so be it. But I'll die knowing I chose right." With a final, seething look, Jexer signaled his guards to back down. Daryal guided the children to a nearby docking pod, quickly activating the launch sequence. As the pod's engines hummed to life, the children looked up at him with expressions of gratitude and relief, and he felt a strange calm settle over him. "You'll be safe," he assured them, meeting each of their gazes. "Find your people. And remember, not all of us are your enemy." With one last nod, Daryal stepped back, watching as the pod launched, disappearing into the dark expanse of space. Turning, he knew he had only moments before the full force of Jexer's wrath would descend upon him. But as he stood alone in the quiet bay, he felt a fierce pride. He had protected the innocent, defied cruelty, and in doing so, had kept a piece of his own honor intact. As the footsteps of approaching guards grew louder, Daryal straightened, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 3: The Reckoning. Daryal was shoved forward, the cold metal cuffs biting into his wrists. The guards flanked him, steering him down the corridor toward the brig, where he'd await his trial for treason. The stark lights overhead cast harsh shadows, and each footstep echoed hollowly, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Though he was bound and under heavy guard, a strange calm settled over him. They reached the brig's holding cells, and Daryal was thrust inside. As the cell door slid shut, he took in his surroundings: sterile walls, a narrow bench bolted to the floor, and a small observation port in the door. Alone with his thoughts, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He'd saved the children, but what would come next? Just as he sat down, the door slid open again, and Captain Jexer strode in, his expression a mask of cold fury. Behind him, 2 guards stood at attention, weapons ready. "Was it worth it, Daryal?" Jexer's voice dripped with disdain. "Throwing away everything for a few pitiful humans?" Daryal met his gaze, unflinching. "I did what I had to do. I couldn't stand by and allow innocent lives to be used as bargaining chips." Jexer sneered, pacing in front of the cell door. "Spare me your sanctimony. You've jeopardized our mission, risked our entire operation, and all for what? To soothe your conscience? Daryal rose, stepping closer to the door. We claim to be an advanced civilization, Jexer. But how advanced are we if we resort to terrorizing children? This isn't victory, it's cowardice. The captain's jaw tightened, his fist clenching. You're a fool, Daryal. Those children meant nothing. You've made yourself a traitor. And for what? An idealistic delusion? Daryal's voice was low but firm. Maybe. But if protecting them makes me a traitor, then I'll accept that title. For a moment, the two stood in tense silence, Jexer's eyes narrowing as he measured Daryal's resolve. Finally, he gestured to the guards. Prepare him for transfer. We'll be making an example of him. As the guards moved toward him, Daryal's mind raced. If he was transferred, he'd be brought before a high council where his punishment would be severe, likely execution. He couldn't let it end like this. He hadn't risked everything just to fade quietly into darkness. As the guards reached for his arms, he shifted suddenly, twisting his body in a fluid movement. One guard staggered back, unprepared, and Daryal took advantage, sweeping the guard's legs out from under him. The other guard lunged, but Daryal countered, using his bound hands to strike his opponent's weapon, sending it clattering across the floor. Enough! Jexer barked, stepping back in shock. But before he could react further, Daryal grabbed the fallen weapon and aimed it squarely at Jexer. The captain froze, his face pale. What are you doing, Daryal? Daryal's gaze was steady, his voice calm. What I should have done long ago. This mission of ours, it's a travesty. If you can't see that, then you're more blind than I thought. The guards hesitated, watching Jexer for orders. Daryal took a deep breath, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. Lower your weapons and listen, he said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. I don't want to harm anyone else, but I can't stand by and watch our people become monsters. Jexer's gaze hardened. You think you're the hero here? You think sacrificing our mission, our strength, makes you noble? He shook his head. The council will see you as nothing more than a traitor. And maybe they're right, Daryal replied, lowering his voice. But I would rather die a traitor than live as a coward. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the blaring of alarms. The emergency lights flickered red, and a voice echoed through the speakers. Asterisk intruder alert in Sector 9. All personnel report to stations immediately. Asterisk. Jexer's face twisted in confusion, and Daryal seized the opportunity. You wanted to prove your might, Jexer. Now's your chance. Without waiting for a response, he bolted down the corridor, weapon in hand. He could hear the guards shouting behind him, but he focused on the sounds of chaos erupting throughout the base. Whatever was happening in Sector 9, it had drawn enough attention to give him a slim window of escape. As he sprinted down the hallway, he spotted an access panel and quickly keyed in a sequence. The display flickered to life, showing the docking bays, and one particular pod that had gone undetected, nestled between two larger vessels. Daryal's heart leapt. It was the pod he had sent the children in. Somehow, it had found its way back, undetected by the base's automated systems. He reached the docking bay just as a group of guards rushed past him, their focus on the intruder alert. Ducking into the shadows, he waited until they passed before slipping into the bay. The pod's hatch opened, and Daryal stepped inside, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Inside, the children stared up at him with a mix of fear and hope, recognizing the one who had freed them. You came back, a young voice asked, barely a whisper. Daryal nodded, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on him. I couldn't leave you, he replied simply. As he took the pilot's seat, he activated the launch sequence, his hands steady as he navigated away from the station. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of the children, their hope fragile, yet unmistakable. The stars stretched before them, an endless expanse of possibility. Just as they cleared the docking bay, a warning flashed on the console. An incoming message from Jexer's command, broadcasting a final threat. Asterisk traitor, if you proceed, you'll be hunted. There's no place in the universe where we won't find you. Asterisk. Daryal exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He could feel the children's eyes on him, a silent promise between them that he would do whatever it took to protect them, no matter the cost. Turning his gaze forward, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. Then let them come. Chapter 4. The Escape. The stars stretched endlessly as Daryal piloted the pod away from the hostile station. His breath was steady, but his mind raced with the stakes of their escape. He glanced over his shoulder at the children, who were huddled together, wide-eyed yet strangely calm. Their presence grounded him, reminding him of the innocence he was protecting. A warning flashed on the control panel. They were being pursued. He adjusted the controls, glancing at the sensor readings to confirm the worst. 2 of Jexer's ships were closing in, their weapon systems powering up. Daryal's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to think clearly. One of the older children noticed the display. "Are they coming after us?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady despite the dread in his gut. "But I won't let them hurt you. I promise." His mind raced, searching for an option. The pod was fast, designed for stealth rather than combat. Evading 2 armed warships would take skill and luck. Daryal knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. As he maneuvered, a voice crackled over the communication system, sharp and unforgiving. Daryal, you can't outrun us. Surrender, and we may consider sparing the children. The words burned, but Daryal forced himself to stay silent. Any reply could give away their strategy, and he wasn't about to betray any advantage, however slim. Instead, he pulled the pod into a sharp dive, skimming the edge of a nearby asteroid field. He kept his breathing measured, navigating through the jagged rocks with as much precision as he could muster. Inside the pod, the children clung to each other, their faces pale. Daryal could feel their fear, the oppressive silence broken only by the hum of the pod's engines. He caught the eye of one of the older girls, a look of determination mingling with her fear. "You're doing well," he said quietly, his voice calm. "Just hold on a little longer." Suddenly, a barrage of lasers streaked past, illuminating the dark rocks in blinding flashes. Daryal jerked the controls, weaving through the debris with practiced hands. But he could feel the pulse of energy beams edging closer, like a predator closing in on its prey. He activated a cloaking field, a last-minute addition he'd managed to modify in case of emergencies. The cloak flickered over the pod, rendering it nearly invisible, but it would only last a few moments. He pulled back sharply, bringing the pod to a halt within the shadow of an enormous asteroid, the thick metal shell shielding them from detection. He whispered to the children, "Stay absolutely silent. We have to wait them out." The pod floated in the shadowed stillness, cloaked and silent. Daryal's gaze fixed on the display, watching as the 2 ships circled the field, their searchlights slicing through the darkness. His fingers hovered over the controls, ready for the slightest shift in their movements. One of the younger children tugged at his sleeve. "Will they find us?" he whispered, eyes wide. Daryal met the child's gaze, his expression softening. "Not if we're careful. We just need a little more time." The lead ship passed within range, close enough that Daryal could see the metallic gleam of its hull, the insignia etched on its side. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm, barely daring to breathe as he kept the pod motionless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the 2 ships began to drift away, convinced they'd lost their target. The pod remained still, and Daryal waited, his patience like a coiled spring, until the sensors showed clear space. He exhaled slowly, releasing tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. The children relaxed, their faces finally easing with relief. Daryal started up the engines, guiding them gently out of the asteroid shadow, careful to avoid any sudden movements that could betray their location. Just as they emerged from the field, a small voice spoke up. Where are we going?" Daryal hesitated, looking at the vast stretch of space before them. "I'm taking you somewhere safe. A planet beyond the reach of Jexer and his allies. Somewhere you can be free." A murmur of hope passed through the group, a soft sound that lifted Daryal's spirits. He adjusted their course, plotting a path toward a distant outpost he remembered from his academy days. It was remote, hidden in the rings of an ice-covered world, and if they could reach it, they'd have a chance to hide and regroup. But his relief was short-lived as an alarm blared on the console. Another ship was closing in, faster, larger, and heavily armed. Daryal's jaw tightened as he recognized the signal. It was Jexer's command vessel. The children watched him with wide eyes, sensing the renewed danger. "We've got one last shot," he murmured, activating the emergency thrusters. The pod surged forward, skimming past the icy rings as he pushed the engines to their limit. The ship's warning alarms filled the pod, and he saw one of the children clutching another's hand, their faces taut with fear. "Hang on," he shouted, steering them toward a dense cloud of ice and debris, the shimmering particles reflecting the starlight in a dazzling cascade. The icy fragments pelted the hull, and he fought to keep control as the pod veered through the chaos. But then, as if fate took pity on them, the control console flickered, signaling an approaching wormhole. It was small and unstable, but it was a way out. "Brace yourselves," he yelled, guiding the pod toward the wormhole's glowing maw. The ship shook violently, the edges of the wormhole bending space around them, light twisting in impossible directions as they shot through. The journey lasted only seconds, but when they emerged on the other side, the silence was profound. No alarms, no pursuing ships, just a vast, empty expanse of stars. Daryal slumped back, exhausted but relieved. The children sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Finally, one of them spoke, a faint smile breaking through. "We made it?" Daryal nodded, a smile of his own forming. "Yes, we're safe. For now." As they drifted toward the distant outpost, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, the weight of his decisions settling around him like a quiet triumph. They had escaped the darkness, against impossible odds, and now they had a future, a fragile, uncertain future, but one filled with hope. He looked back at the children, their eyes shining with trust and gratitude. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of something beyond survival, a purpose, a chance to rebuild not only his own path but theirs. He had risked everything, and in the vast silence of space, he felt his heart swell with quiet pride. As the pod sailed forward, leaving behind the shadows of war, Daryal finally allowed himself to hope.